The pre-dawn darkness of May 1st, 1898, hung heavy over Manila Bay like a shroud of anticipation. Commodore George Dewey stood on the bridge of his flagship, the USS Olympia, watching the distant silhouette of Spanish fortifications emerge from the tropical mist. His weathered hands gripped the railing as he contemplated the moment that would either crown his naval career with glory or send him to a watery grave in these foreign waters. Behind him, the American Asiatic Squadron moved in perfect formation. Through the calm water, 6 warships cutting through the bay like steel predators stalking their prey. The USS Baltimore, Boston, Raleigh, Petrel, and Concord followed in his wake, their crews having spent the night in restless preparation for what many believed would be their final battle. The Spanish-American War had erupted just weeks earlier, and now, thousands of miles from American shores, Dewey was about to test the mettle of his men against the once mighty Spanish Empire. The Commodore's mind raced back to his orders from Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt in the event of declaration of war with Spain. Your duty will be to see that the Spanish squadron does not leave the Asiatic station, and that no Spanish naval vessel is permitted to operate against American interests. Those words had burned into his consciousness during the long journey across the Pacific. And now the moment of reckoning had arrived, as reported in contemporary accounts from the New York Herald. Dewey had spent months preparing for this confrontation, studying every detail of Spanish naval strength in the Philippines and drilling his crews to perfection. The Spanish fleet, commanded by Admiral Patricio Montoyo y Pasaron, consisted of 7 vessels anchored in a defensive line near Cavite, the flagship Reina Cristina, Castilla Don Antonio de Ulloa, Don Juan de Austria, Isla de Luzon, Isla de Cuba, and the gunboat marks Del Duaro, though numerically similar. The Spanish ships were older, less well-armed, and manned by crews who had not seen significant action in decades. The tropical heat was already beginning to rise from the water as the sun crested the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds that seemed to foreshadow the fire and smoke that would soon engulf the bay. Dewey could see the Spanish ships clearly now, their dark hulls creating an ominous line across the water. Admiral Montoyo had chosen his position carefully, anchoring his fleet in shallow water near the shore batteries at Cavite, hoping that the combined firepower of ships and fortifications would prove decisive against the American interlopers. But Dewey had anticipated this strategy. Intelligence reports had revealed the weaknesses in Spanish preparations: outdated ammunition, poorly maintained guns, and a fleet that had been allowed to deteriorate under colonial neglect. The Commodore's own ships, though fewer in number, boasted modern weaponry, well-trained gun crews, and the latest in naval technology. The USS Olympia alone carried 4 8-inch guns and 10 5-inch rapid-fire cannons. More than enough firepower to cripple any Spanish vessel. As the distance between the two fleets closed, Dewey could feel the tension building among his crew. Men who had joked and played cards just hours earlier now stood at their battle stations with grim determination, knowing that within minutes Manila Bay would erupt in thunder and flame. The Commodore checked his pocket watch. 5:40 in the morning. History was about to unfold in these tropical waters, and George Dewey intended to write it with American steel and gunpowder. The morning sun climbed higher over Manila Bay as Commodore Dewey's squadron approached the Spanish line at a steady 8 knots. The water was mirror-smooth, broken only by the wakes of the American warships as they maintained their precise formation. At exactly 5:40 in the morning, the first Spanish shot rang out from the shore batteries at Cavite, the shells splashing harmlessly into the water several hundred yards short of the USS Olympia. Captain Charles Vernon Gridley, commanding officer of the Olympia, stood beside Dewey on the bridge, his eyes fixed on the enemy fleet through his binoculars. The Spanish ships had begun to maneuver, their black smoke rising into the clear morning air as they attempted to form a more defensive position. Admiral Montoyo's flagship, the Reina Cristina, led the Spanish line, her crew clearly visible as they rushed to their guns. "The range is closing nicely, sir," Gridley reported, his voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. The American squadron had now moved within effective firing range, approximately 5,000 yards from the Spanish fleet. Dewey could see the enemy gun crews preparing to engage, their weapons trained on his approaching ships. The Commodore removed his white cap, wiping perspiration from his brow as he studied the tactical situation one final time. His ships held every advantage: superior speed, better training, and more modern armaments. The Spanish fleet, anchored in shallow water with their escape routes limited, presented perfect targets for his gunners. According to naval historians' accounts, detailed in Harper's Weekly, Dewey had drilled his crews extensively during the Pacific crossing, ensuring that every man knew his role in the coming battle. At precisely 5:53 in the morning, Commodore Dewey turned to his flag captain with the words that would echo through naval history, "You may fire when ready." Gridley. The captain immediately relayed the order to the Olympia's gun crews, and seconds later the flagship's forward 8-inch turret erupted in flame and smoke, sending the first American shell screaming toward the Spanish line. The thunderous roar of the Olympia's guns seemed to shatter the tropical morning calm, and within moments, the entire American squadron had opened fire. The USS Baltimore's 6-inch guns joined the chorus, followed by the rapid-fire batteries of the Boston, Raleigh, Petrel, and Concord. The bay filled with the acrid smoke of gunpowder and the whistling shriek of shells as American projectiles rained down on the Spanish positions. Admiral Montoyo responded immediately, ordering his fleet to return fire with everything at their disposal. The Reina Cristina's main battery boomed across the water, her shells falling dangerously close to the Olympia as the Spanish gunners found their range. The older warship Castilla, though immobilized and serving essentially as a floating battery, added her firepower to the Spanish response. The Don Antonio de Ulloa and Don Juan de Austria maneuvered desperately, their crews working frantically to bring their guns to bear on the American squadron. The noise was deafening. Continuous thunder of heavy guns punctuated by the sharp crack of rapid-fire weapons and the explosive impact of shells striking home. Smoke clouds drifted across the water, periodically obscuring the battle as both fleets maintained their murderous exchange. Dewey ordered his ships to steam in an elliptical pattern, keeping them in constant motion while maintaining optimal firing positions against the stationary Spanish targets. Within the first 20 minutes of combat, the superior American gunnery began to tell. The Spanish flagship Reina Cristina, bearing the brunt of concentrated fire from multiple American vessels, showed visible signs of damage. Her superstructure was riddled with holes, her mainmast had been shot away, and fires had broken out amidships. Still, Admiral Montoyo refused to surrender, ordering his remaining ships to continue the fight even as American shells systematically demolished his fleet. The USS Olympia herself had taken several hits, but her superior construction and armor protection minimized the damage. One Spanish shell had punched through her hull above the waterline, while another had destroyed part of her rigging, but her fighting capability remained unimpaired. Dewey's tactical decision to keep his ships moving proved crucial, as the Spanish gunners struggled to target the constantly maneuvering American vessels. By 7 o'clock in the morning, the devastating effectiveness of American naval gunnery had transformed Manila Bay into a scene of utter destruction. The Spanish fleet, which had appeared so formidable in the pre-dawn darkness, now lay scattered and burning across the shallow waters near Cavite. Admiral Montoyo's proud flagship, the Reina Cristina, listed heavily to port, her decks awash with seawater pouring through countless shell holes in her hull. The wooden-hulled Castilla had fared even worse under the relentless American bombardment. Built decades earlier and never intended to face modern naval artillery, she had been reduced to little more than a floating wreck. Her wooden sides, pierced by dozens of shells, could no longer keep the bay water at bay. Thick, black smoke poured from fires burning throughout her interior, and her crew had begun abandoning ship as the vessel settled deeper into the shallow water. Commodore Dewey ordered a temporary ceasefire at 7:30 to assess the situation and allow his ships to replenish their ammunition. The lull in gunfire revealed the full extent of Spanish losses. 5 vessels were either sinking, burning, or completely disabled. The Don Antonio de Ulloa had run aground deliberately to prevent her from sinking in deep water. while the smaller gunboat Marks del Duaro had been blown, part by a direct hit from one of the Baltimore's 6-inch shells. During this pause in the battle, as documented in dispatches later published in the Washington Post, Dewey received reports from his ship captains confirming minimal American casualties. The USS Olympia had suffered only minor damage, with 8 men slightly wounded, none seriously. The other ships in the squadron reported similar results: a few superficial hits, negligible structural damage, and casualties that could be counted on one hand. The contrast with Spanish losses was staggering. Admiral Montoyo's fleet had been systematically destroyed, with over 300 officers and men killed or wounded. The Reina Cristina alone had lost over 150 crew members, including many of her senior officers. The admiral himself had been forced to abandon his burning flagship and transfer his flag to the small gunboat Isla de Cuba, one of the few Spanish vessels still capable of maneuvering. As the morning progressed, Spanish resistance began to collapse entirely. The shore batteries at Cavite, which had opened the battle with such enthusiasm, had been silenced by accurate fire from American ships. The battery positions, constructed in an earlier era of warfare, provided inadequate protection against modern naval artillery. American shells had systematically destroyed the Spanish guns and driven their crews from their positions. At 10:30, Commodore Dewey ordered his squadron to resume the attack and finish the destruction of the Spanish fleet. The American ships moved in closer to shore, their guns trained on the remaining Spanish vessels and shore installations. The USS Petrel and Concord, the smallest vessels in Dewey's squadron, demonstrated remarkable courage by steaming directly into the shallow waters near Cavite to engage the surviving Spanish ships at point-blank range. The final phase of the battle resembled less a naval engagement than a methodical execution. The Spanish ships, immobilized and outgunned, could offer only token resistance as American shells completed their destruction. The Don Juan de Austria, which had fought gallantly throughout the morning, finally succumbed to the concentrated fire of multiple American vessels. Her magazines exploded in a tremendous blast that sent debris flying hundreds of yards in all directions. Admiral Montoyo, recognizing the hopelessness of further resistance, ordered the white flag raised on his remaining ships. The once mighty Spanish fleet in the Philippines had been completely annihilated in less than 7 hours of combat. Not a single Spanish vessel remained capable of offensive action, while Dewey's squadron remained essentially intact and ready for further operations. The Battle of Manila Bay was over, but its consequences would reshape the balance of power in the Pacific and mark the emergence of the United States as a global naval force. In those tropical waters, amid the smoke and wreckage of Spanish ambitions, America had announced its arrival on the world stage with thunderous authority as the smoke gradually cleared over Manila Bay on that historic May morning.
The full magnitude
Of American naval victory became undeniably apparent. Commodore Dewey ordered his ships to cease firing at 11:15, and an eerie silence settled over waters that had thundered with cannon fire for nearly 6 hours. The Spanish fleet had been completely annihilated. Not a single vessel remained capable of offering further resistance to American forces. The USS Olympia's signal flags snapped in the tropical breeze as Dewey dispatched messages to his squadron, commanders ordering damage assessment reports and casualty counts. The results, when they arrived, seemed almost impossible to believe. The entire American squadron had suffered exactly one fatality: Chief Engineer Francis Randall of the USS Boston, who had died of heat exhaustion in his ship's engine room. During the intense morning combat, in stark contrast, Spanish losses mounted with each passing hour as rescue parties searched through the wreckage of Montoyo's fleet. The Reina Cristina had lost 167 officers and men, including her captain and most of her senior staff. Castilla, completely destroyed by American gunfire, had seen 93 of her crew killed or wounded. Total Spanish casualties exceeded 380 men, with many more missing and presumed drowned in the shallow waters of Cavite. Admiral Patricio Montoyo, evacuated from his burning flagship hours earlier, surveyed the destruction from the deck of the small gunboat Isla de Cuba with visible anguish, according to eyewitness accounts later published in the London Times. The Spanish commander appeared stunned by the speed and completeness of his defeat. His fleet, which had seemed adequate for colonial defense just days earlier, had proven woefully inadequate against modern American naval power. The strategic implications of the victory extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation in Manila Bay. Spain's ability to defend her Pacific colonies had been completely eliminated in a single morning's work. The Philippines, Guam, and other Spanish territories in the region now lay defenseless before American naval power. Dewey's victory had effectively ended Spanish colonial rule in the Pacific and positioned the United States to claim these territories. For herself, news of the triumph would take weeks to reach the United States. Traveling by ship and telegraph across thousands of miles of ocean and land, when word finally arrived in Washington, it would trigger celebrations throughout American cities and establish Commodore Dewey as a national hero overnight. The victory demonstrated convincingly that American naval reforms of the 1880s and 90s had created a fleet capable of challenging European powers on equal terms. The battle also validated new concepts in naval tactics and technology that had been developing throughout the late 19th century. Dewey's use of continuous movement during combat, maintaining optimal firing positions while minimizing enemy accuracy, proved the superiority of speed and maneuver over static defensive positions. His concentration of firepower against individual enemy vessels demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated squadron tactics. Spanish preparations for the defense of Manila Bay had been based on outdated concepts of colonial warfare. Admiral Montoyo had positioned his fleet in shallow water, near shore batteries, expecting that combined firepower would compensate for his ship's individual weaknesses. This strategy might have succeeded against earlier generations of warships, proved disastrously inadequate against modern American artillery and fire control systems. The technological gap between the opposing fleets had been decisive. American ships carried the latest in naval armament, including rapid-fire guns, improved ammunition, and modern fire control systems that allowed accurate shooting at extended ranges. Spanish vessels, many dating from the 1870s and earlier, mounted obsolete weapons served by poorly trained crews who had not engaged in serious gunnery practice for years. As the afternoon sun climbed higher over Manila Bay, Commodore Dewey began planning his next moves. The Spanish fleet had been destroyed, but the city of Manila itself remained under Spanish control, defended by substantial land forces. The Commodore would need to establish communication with Filipino insurgents, fighting Spanish rule while awaiting reinforcements from the United States to complete the conquest of the Philippines. The tropical afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Manila Bay as Commodore Dewey surveyed the scene of his unprecedented triumph from the bridge of the USS Olympia. Smoke still rose from the smoldering hulks of Spanish warships scattered across the shallow waters near Cavite, creating a grim monument to the morning's devastating combat. The American flag flew proudly from the Olympia's mainmast, its stars and stripes snapping in the warm breeze that carried the acrid smell of gunpowder and burning wood across the bay. Within hours of the battle's conclusion, word of the American victory began spreading throughout the Philippines. Filipino insurgents who had been fighting Spanish colonial rule for years under the leadership of Emilio Aguinaldo received the news with tremendous excitement. The complete destruction of Spanish naval power meant that their colonial oppressors could no longer receive reinforcements or supplies by sea, fundamentally altering the balance of power throughout the archipelago. Spanish authorities in Manila found themselves in an impossible position. Governor-General Basilio Agustin Davila commanded approximately 13,000 troops scattered throughout the Philippines. But without naval support, these forces were effectively isolated and cut off from Spain. The loss of the fleet meant that Spanish rule, which had endured for more than 3 centuries, was now living on borrowed time. Dewey wasted no time in capitalizing on his victory. He immediately established a naval blockade of Manila Bay, preventing any Spanish vessels from entering or leaving the harbor. The Commodore also began negotiations with Filipino rebel leaders, recognizing that their cooperation would be essential for any successful assault on the heavily fortified city of Manila itself. As recorded in diplomatic correspondence, later published in congressional records, These early meetings laid the groundwork for the complex political situation that would dominate Philippine-American relations for decades to come. The international reaction to Dewey's victory proved equally significant. European naval experts, who had dismissed American maritime capabilities just months earlier, suddenly found themselves forced to reassess the strategic balance in the Pacific. Great Britain, Germany, and France all dispatched additional warships to Asian waters, ostensibly to protect their citizens, but actually to monitor American intentions in the region. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany proved particularly aggressive in his response, ordering a substantial naval squadron under Vice Admiral Otto von Diederich to Manila Bay, the German fleet. Consisting of 5 warships, including the powerful cruiser Kaiserin Augusta, arrived in late June and immediately began challenging American authority in the bay. Dewey, though heavily outnumbered, refused to be intimidated by German posturing and maintained strict control over all ship movements in Manila waters. The tense confrontation with German forces created the potential for a major international incident. Von Diederich repeatedly tested American resolve by violating Dewey's blockade regulations and conducting unauthorized surveys of Manila's defenses. The German admiral's actions were clearly designed to establish German claims to Philippine territory should American occupation prove temporary or unsuccessful. Back in the United States, news of Dewey's triumph finally reached Washington on May 7, 1898, transmitted via telegraph from Hong Kong. President William McKinley, who had been anxiously awaiting word from the Pacific, received the report during a cabinet meeting and immediately shared it with his assembled advisors. According to contemporary accounts in the New York Tribune, the president's first reaction was one of profound relief he had authorized Dewey's attack on Manila without knowing whether the Commodore possessed sufficient strength to achieve victory. The American public's response exceeded even the most optimistic expectations of government officials. Dewey became an instant national hero, his name appearing in newspaper headlines from coast to coast. Cities throughout the United States organized spontaneous victory celebrations, while Congress began discussing plans to promote the Commodore to admiral and award him a special gold medal in recognition of his achievement. The strategic implications of the victory continued to unfold throughout the following weeks and months. Spain's defeat in Manila Bay effectively ended her status as a global colonial power, while simultaneously establishing the United States as a major force in Pacific affairs. The acquisition of the Philippines would provide America with naval bases and coaling stations essential for projecting power throughout East Asia, fundamentally altering the balance of international relations in the region. For Commodore Dewey personally, the victory represented the culmination of a distinguished naval career spanning nearly 4 decades. His tactical brilliance in Manila Bay had achieved one of the most complete naval victories in modern history, establishing his place among the great admirals of all time while securing its American dominance in the Pacific for generations to come. The complete annihilation of Spain's Pacific fleet sent shockwaves rippling across the diplomatic landscape of the late 19th century, fundamentally altering the balance of global power in ways that would influence international relations for decades to come. Within weeks of Dewey's triumph, European chancelleries from London to Berlin were frantically reassessing their strategic calculations in light of America's sudden emergence as a formidable naval power, capable of projecting force across the world's largest ocean. In Madrid, the Spanish government of Prime Minister Praxedes Mateo Sagasta faced the grim reality that their 3-century-old empire in the Pacific had been eliminated in a single morning's combat. Queen Regent Maria Cristina, serving as regent for her young son, Alfonso XIII, convened emergency sessions of the Council of Ministers to consider Spain's limited options. The loss of naval supremacy in Philippine waters meant that the archipelago's 13,000 Spanish troops were effectively marooned. Cut off from reinforcement or resupply from the motherland, President McKinley, meanwhile, found himself grappling with the unexpected consequences of total victory. His original war aims had focused primarily on Cuban independence and the expulsion of Spanish forces from the Caribbean. The complete destruction of Spanish power in the Philippines presented both tremendous opportunities and equally significant challenges for American foreign policy. As documented in State Department archives later released to historians, McKinley spent sleepless nights weighing the implications of American territorial expansion into Asia. The German response to American success proved particularly aggressive and concerning. Kaiser Wilhelm II, already resentful of American commercial expansion in Pacific markets, viewed Dewey's victory as a direct threat to German colonial ambitions in the region. The Kaiser dispatched Vice Admiral Otto von Diedericks with explicit instructions to establish a German naval presence in Philippine waters and to be prepared to seize territory should American occupation prove temporary or unsuccessful. British reaction, while officially neutral, reflected the complex calculations of imperial strategy in an era of shifting alliances. Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour recognized that American control of the Philippines would actually serve British interests. By preventing German expansion in the region, the Royal Navy's dominance in Asian waters made American territorial acquisition preferable to German colonization, leading to quiet British support for Dewey's position during subsequent diplomatic crises. French officials in Paris adopted a more cautious approach, viewing American expansion with concern, while recognizing their limited ability to influence events in such distant waters. Foreign Minister Théophile Delcasse ordered the French Asiatic Squadron to maintain strict neutrality while monitoring developments that might affect French colonial interests in Indochina. The French government's primary concern centered on ensuring that American expansion would not threaten their own territories in the region. Back in Manila Bay, Commodore Dewey found himself functioning as both military commander and de facto American ambassador to the Philippines. His negotiations with Filipino insurgent leader Emilio Aguinaldo required delicate diplomatic skills. As the rebel commander expected American support for complete Philippine independence in exchange for cooperation against Spanish forces, Dewey, lacking clear guidance from Washington, made provisional agreements that would later create significant complications for American policy in the region. The Commodore also faced the challenging task of managing relationships with the various European naval commanders who began arriving in Manila waters throughout the summer months. Each foreign admiral brought specific instructions from his government regarding the protection of national interests and citizens, but many also carried secret orders to be prepared to seize territory should opportunities arise. Dewey's small squadron, though victorious against the Spanish, was heavily outnumbered by the combined European fleets gathering in the bay. The most serious international incident occurred in late July, when Admiral von Diedericks attempted to land German troops on the pretext of protecting German nationals in Manila. Dewey, recognizing this as a transparent attempt to establish German territorial claims, ordered his ships to battle stations and personally confronted the German admiral. According to eyewitness accounts published in Harper's Magazine, Dewey's firm stance forced the Germans to back down, but the incident demonstrated the delicate nature of the international situation in Philippine waters. Meanwhile, in Washington, the McKinley administration grappled with the fundamental question of what to do with the Philippines. American victory had been so complete and so unexpected that no detailed plans existed for governing the archipelago. Secretary of State William R. Day found himself coordinating with military officials to develop policies for territories that the United States had never intended to acquire. The administration faced pressure from expansionists who viewed the Philippines as a stepping stone to Asian markets, while anti-imperialists argued that colonial rule contradicted fundamental American principles of self-governance and democracy. As 1898 drew to a close, the reverberations of Commodore Dewey's thunderous victory at Manila Bay continued to reshape the global order in ways that would define the 20th century. The Treaty of Paris, signed on December 10th, formally transferred the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico from Spanish to American control, marking the United States' emergence as a colonial power and fundamentally altering the nation's role. In world affairs, the strategic transformation proved profound and lasting. American acquisition of naval bases in the Philippines provided the United States with the forward positions necessary to project power throughout the Pacific and protect growing American commercial interests in Asia, the harbor at Manila became a crucial coaling station for American warships, while Subic Bay developed into one of the most important naval facilities in the Pacific. These bases would prove essential during both World Wars, serving as springboards for American military operations across the vast Pacific theater. For Spain, the defeat marked the final collapse of a once mighty global empire that had dominated world affairs for centuries. The loss of the Philippines, combined with defeats in the Caribbean, reduced Spain to a second-rate European power with limited international influence. The psychological impact on Spanish society proved equally devastating, contributing to domestic political instability and intellectual movements that questioned traditional Spanish values and institutions. The victory's impact on American society exceeded even the most optimistic predictions of contemporary observers. Dewey returned to the United States in 1899 as the greatest military hero since the Civil War, receiving ticker-tape parades in major cities and serious consideration as a presidential candidate. Congress promoted him to Admiral of the Navy, a rank created specifically to honor his achievement, and awarded him a jeweled sword valued at $10,000. As reported extensively in McClure's magazine, Dewey's popularity reached such heights that enterprising manufacturers marketed everything from Dewey breakfast cereals to commemorative dinner plates bearing his likeness. However, the victory also generated significant controversy within American society. Anti-imperialist leaders like Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, and former President Grover Cleveland argued passionately that colonial rule over the Philippines violated fundamental American principles of self-determination and democratic governance. The Anti-Imperialist League, founded in 1898, organized massive rallies and published extensive literature, condemning what they viewed as America's betrayal of its founding ideals. The Filipino perspective on these developments proved far more complex than American policymakers had anticipated. While many Filipinos initially welcomed American victory over their Spanish colonial masters, enthusiasm quickly turned to resistance when it became clear that the United States intended to establish its own colonial government rather than grant immediate independence. Emilio Aguinaldo, who had cooperated with Dewey during the siege of Manila, declared Philippine independence and organized armed resistance against American occupation forces, the resulting Philippine-American War. 1902 proved far more costly and controversial than the original conflict with Spain. American forces faced determined Filipino guerrilla resistance that required more than 126,000 American troops to suppress. The conflict resulted in over 4,000 American deaths and an estimated 200,000 Filipino casualties, creating lasting controversies about American colonial policies and military conduct. The international ramifications of Dewey's victory continued to influence global politics well into the 20th century. Germany's failure to seize Philippine territory during the power vacuum following Spanish defeat contributed to growing German resentment of American expansion, eventually becoming one factor in the complex web of rivalries that led to World War I. Japan's observation of American naval capabilities in the Philippines influenced Japanese strategic planning and contributed to the rise of Japanese militarism in the following decades. The technological lessons learned from the Battle of Manila Bay revolutionized naval warfare worldwide. The effectiveness of rapid-fire guns, importance of superior training and fire control, and the decisive advantage of speed and maneuverability over static defense became standard elements of naval doctrine. European powers rushed to modernize their fleets based on American innovations demonstrated in Philippine waters, accelerating the naval arms race that characterized the early 20th century. For the United States Navy, Manila Bay marked the beginning of a new era of global responsibility and technological advancement. The service that had been largely confined to coastal defense just decades earlier suddenly found itself operating bases and squadrons across the Pacific. This expansion required fundamental changes in naval organization, training, and logistics that transformed the American military establishment today. More than a century after those thunderous guns fell silent in Manila Bay, Dewey's victory stands as one of the most decisive naval battles in modern history. The complete destruction of Spanish naval power in a single engagement, achieved with minimal American losses, demonstrated the revolutionary impact of modern technology and superior training on maritime warfare. The battle's strategic consequences: America's emergence as a Pacific power, the end of Spanish colonial empire, and the beginning of American overseas expansion shaped the course of 20th century history in ways that continue to influence international relations today. In the quiet waters of Manila Bay, where Spanish warships once burned and sank beneath the tropical sun, modern visitors can still sense the echoes of that fateful May morning when American thunder announced a new chapter in world history.